Learning how to master your own songs is one of the best skills you can build as a music producer. And that is true even if you still send your music to an experienced mastering engineer for the final master. But if you can't create at least a decent sounding test master for you to try out in clubs, to play in your sets and to see how it stacks up against the competition, you're seriously missing out on a skill that will make your mixes and your productions massively better. So in today's video, I'm going to master a melodic techno track and I'm going to walk you through everything step by step so you can follow along. Join me on the ride, let's get into it. So here we are in Ableton Live. Now, mind you, as a professional mastering engineer, I don't use Ableton Live mastering songs for clients. I use Wavelab, which is a specialized mastering DAW. I've been using this for years. I'm really happy. But, and this is really important, it's not necessary. If you want to create your own test masters, you don't need a specialized mastering DAW. You can definitely do it in Ableton. I will use some of the tools that I'm using though, so external plugins. But if you want me to make, for example, a video just mastering with Ableton stock tools, leave a comment below. I'd be really curious to hear if that's interesting to you. Now, the song that we're working on is a melodic techno track called Leaving by an artist named Paul Conrad. Paul is also a member of our coaching program, and we took him from 0 releases, like tracks that weren't even close to being releasable, to now having more than 10 releases under his belt. This is track number 11 that comes out. The next one is already booked in, so he's consistently shipping great sounding songs, and now we're working on these masters with him. So in case you also want to break through a certain plateau, want to finish music consistently and also be able to release it, find that inner confidence, go to pickyourself.com/coaching and leave your application there. I'm happy to hear from you, and my team and I are happy to welcome you in our circle. Let's listen to the track and see where we are currently. So what I typically do is I don't listen to this from start to finish. I jump into just specific sections, especially the breakdown and a little bit of the peak part. So let's flip through that. What a beautiful, dreamy, atmospheric track. I really love the sound that Paul has developed, that he's found for himself. The production is also already at a really high level. I already think about a couple of things that I'm going to share with you in a minute. But the big question that you probably have is, why does Philip not listen to the whole track? Isn't that what mastering engineers do? Well, to be honest with you, I keep my ears as fresh as possible for as long as possible. So that means I do the masters always in the morning when my ears are not tired at all. And I also listen to only as much music as I need to get the information. And then I pause, take action, take the next steps. And of course, very last step is quality control, where you listen to everything and you double check your settings work, and maybe you have to change some settings for specific parts. All of that good stuff still happens in the process. So as you can probably tell, the track sounds quite lush. It's also not as bright and very focused on the low mids and the low end. So it's a really warm and organic sound. Now the question is that intentional, or does the artist want something different? And this is why I always send a file delivery and export guide to the clients, and they basically fill out a couple of questions that give me these details. So here's what this sheet looks like. They fill in a couple of infos on the track, on the naming and so on. And then I ask these questions. So do you prefer an open and dynamic sounding production, or do you like it loud and aggressive? And as you can tell, that is a spectrum with two different sides, and they have to basically place themselves somewhere on that line. The second question is, are you looking for a warm and organic sound, or something more analytical and precise? So once again, they have to place themselves on that spectrum. And sometimes they choose something in the middle, which is like, well, not too warm, but also not super bright, which is also okay. Now I can then take those data points and match them with, first of all, the music that I'm hearing from them. So what does the actual pre-master sound like? But then I also ask them to give me a couple of reference tracks if possible. And then I can counter all these data points, and if there's a huge clash, so let's say the reference tracks sound extremely different from what they're producing, or what they're writing in their answers is very different from what that track sounds like. Then I can just hop on a quick call, get to know them a bit better, and figure out like what is the intention behind this, and make sure that there's no miscommunication happening. Now with Paul, obviously we know him quite well, so it's pretty clear where we're going with this. And just so you know, I also include a file delivery guide, which tells you how to export stuff. It's pretty self-explanatory, so you typically use the sample rate that your project is originally in. So if you worked in 44.1 kilohertz, export at 44.1 kilohertz. For bit depth, you always use the highest bit depth that's available. So 32-bit floating point is what the most DAWs allow you to export. If you you are used to exporting 24-bit files for whatever reason, because some other guy told you this, there's no harm, like nothing's being changed by using 32-bit floating point as an export file. It only makes it better. The advantage here is that there's so much headroom that even if there's like a couple of overs, like beyond 0 dB on the master channel, that's not really a problem because the 32-bit floating point file can be normalized to below 0 by the mastering engineer, and there's no bad consequences. With a 24-bit fixed file, it's definitely not possible. So if there is something overshooting, so above 0 dB FS, this is not something we can change anymore. Now, if you want me to do a separate video just on the exporting process, let me know in the comments. I would love to do this if that's something you request, and let's get on to the mastering now. So the first plugin that I insert, which will be the very last in the chain, is the metric AB comparison plugin. So this is for referencing. I've made a video specifically on how to use reference and work with referencing tools. I do a couple of things. I pull in the tracks that the artist has sent me, and I loop specific sections. So always kind of the peak part of the song. And then I very often go to the loudness tab here and I activate the dual mode. So in single, this is just looking at the reference. On dual mode, you can basically see this is our track, the blue one, and this is the other one. Why do I do this? So this becomes really important at the end of the process, because then I want to see, okay, are we loudness wise at least in the ballpark of the reference tracks? So I'm never trying to match the exact loudness of any reference. Like there's no reason to do so, because these days in Spotify, everything will be normalized down to -14 anyway, even for DJ sets. So if people import it in their sets, it's so easy to just match the gain. So we just want to be ballpark in the same region. But it tells me something about the reference tracks, and it tells me something about my track. So if I can get our track to sound more or less as loud as the other one, but in terms of the LUFS numbers, it's still less, that's actually a good thing, because it means that Spotify will bring the other tracks down even more and ours not as much. So we're basically loudness wise, or perceived loudness wise, still the winner in this whole game. And no, the loudness war is not over. Now the good thing is that with this specific track, it's relatively easy because it doesn't call for huge loudness levels. Interestingly, when I play these other tracks, you will notice that they're quite hot, like quite loud. I can't play the music, unfortunately, because I don't have the copyright. So we're here around like -7, 6. Interestingly, I also heard a little bit of clicking in there, where I'm not sure if that is intentional or not. And so once again, around like -7, -8 LUFS. Yeah, this one is also around -7. These are still considered relatively loud, and I can understand it because they are a little bit more anthemic, a little bit more peak time oriented than the track that we are working on. And ours is currently sitting -15, -16, which is perfectly fine for a unmastered song. I will do a step that a lot of mastering engineers do, probably not everyone, but I've seen a lot of others do this as well. And that is, we will insert a limiter right away before this and trying to get in the ballpark loudness already in the very early part of the process. So I'm using the FabFilter Pro L2 here. It's my favorite limiter besides the Ozone Maximizer, which is also great. I always set it to -0.1 true peak. So true peak limiting means that the sidechain signal, the signal that the limiter uses to analyze what it's going to do, this sidechain signal will be oversampled. So the limiter basically also finds intersample peaks that are normally not detected between the two sample points. And we're working in 48 kilohertz right now. The true peak limiter is going to upsample the analysis signal, so to speak, and it's going to detect the peaks that happen between the sample points and basically brings them down as well. I try to not get too technical in here. If you still have follow-up questions, just let me know in the comments. But this is a video not for mastering engineers or people who want to become mastering engineers. It's a video for producers who want to self-master tracks. So apologies if I don't go into all the technical details that stand behind these processes. Okay, true peak limiting. Most current limiters have this function. You could also just go around and use oversampling. So if I use 4 times oversampling, I basically don't need the true peak limiting because it will also oversample the original signal. You basically don't need it in this case if we're working with true peak limiting. This saves CPU. In my mastering DAW, I work at higher sample rates anyway, so mainly on 96 6 kilohertz. Very different reasons for that, which I can get into in a different video if you want. But yeah, if you are producing and you don't have like a super high quality, fast, latest generation computer and you run into CPU issues, then just don't use oversampling. But peak time limiting definitely makes sense, which is a form of oversampling as well. Attack and release times here, it's not like the compressor attack time, it's the attack time until the release ballistics kick in. If you crank this to 10 seconds, it's basically acting like a clipper. And if you have it like this, you're basically taming more of the peaks that are happening in the signal. And you're taming it like super, super quickly. The release circuit will kick in, and depending on how you set this, it's going to change the curve. I'll just play it and you will see what happens and hear what happens. So I have this now completely at 0. So you see you have this like really round shape. So the signal is pretty heavily shaped by the limiter right now. If I keep this in a more relaxed state, you see that this gets way, way shorter, and it's basically just reacting on the peaks themselves, not so much on the rest of the signal. And this is what I actually like much more for electronic music, because I keep a lot of the actual low-end movement intact. It just literally only reacts to a couple of peaks here and there. And this is, in my opinion, a more transparent way of limiting. I like this quite a lot. So let's see how far we have to push this. So this is way too loud in my opinion for this type of music. What I'm listening to is the density of the material. How dense does it feel? And if it sounds squashed with this type of atmospheric music, definitely does not make sense. So I can go down and back up a little bit. This would be the absolute maximum that I would push this currently. Now, bear in mind, we haven't done anything else in the mastering chain yet. So what typically happens is you will do different things before it actually hits the limiter, which lead to the limiter working in a bit more relaxed way, because you've done something in the frequency domain. You've done a little bit to control some of the peaks before with clipping. You maybe also did a little bit of compression, and all of that gets the signal in shape so that the limiter does not have to work as hard in the end. This means we'll now jump to the beginning of the mastering chain, go through this step by step, and then at the last stage we can then readjust the limiter to basically make sure that it's working exactly as we want it to. So the very first tool that I use in mastering is the infrasonic filter. Bear in mind, enabled, when you just load something, it always puts it to the end of the chain, of course. You have to bring it to the beginning now. This is by Tokyo Dawn Labs, super cool company. I love their tools. They're really affordable yet high quality. What this does is you can use this as either a high pass filter, and it's just focused on the very, very low end. So you can just bring it to 50 Hertz and down to 5 Hertz. But the cool thing is that you can adjust the slope as a percentage, and you don't have these stepped slopes like 6 dB per octave, 12 dB per octave, 24. You can actually dial this in exactly in the way you want, and you can also turn it into kind of a low shelf by using mix knob here. And this all in all is pretty cool. Now, I already know that some people will comment here, "Whoa, you should never use a high pass filter because it affects the phase of the signal." Relax. I'll get to this in a second. So here's an interesting observation that I've made. 5 to 10 years ago, everyone and their mother were telling you that you have to always cut the low end aggressively so you have more headroom to work with in the master. So they cut super aggressively at 30, 40, and at some point even 50 Hertz just to get like a couple of extra dB maybe that they can push into their final limiter. That's pretty problematic, it turns out, because that massively affects how the material sounds. So I can just play this for you. There's too much low end missing. It doesn't make sense to me at all, especially not on big club and festival systems that can easily reproduce 50, 40, even 20 Hertz. and you will definitely feel what's missing there. This advice has changed over the years. So back then, everyone was telling you that this is the way to do it. Then people who had not enough experience were just commenting this under every video who didn't do it. Now we have the opposite movement. Everyone is telling you you should never high pass a signal because it's changing the phase of the audio. And while that is technically true, yes, high pass filter has an effect on the phase or consequence. This does not mean that you shouldn't use it. It just means that yes, you have to keep this effect in mind, and it probably won't even be a problem. If you actually want to do this cut, then do this cut and it's fine. The advice now that gets spread everywhere is, oh, you should absolutely use a low shelf filter. That's the new thing. Like you should use a low shelf filter because that has less effect on the phase. And while yes, this is technically true, it also means that in some cases, this is the better choice. In other cases, it's not such a good choice. And this is why I love this tool, because it lets me dial in the specific shape that I want. And in so many instances, I don't even have it activated. Like it's not doing anything. I just test it out and figure out, no, it's actually not sounding better, period. But in some cases, yes, I have to do that cut, that one, for example. Yeah, sometimes that happens. Okay, let's listen to the material and decide what we want to do with it. Very subtle. If you don't hear this, no worries at all. There's also going to be some compression that you probably don't hear later on. And that's perfectly fine. It just means your critical listening skills have to evolve. Also, you're probably not hearing on the same mastering grade headphones, which is also fine. This just develops over time and it's completely fine. This takes years. It doesn't take weeks. It doesn't take months. It takes years to develop certain critical listening skills. Perfectly fine. What I'm hearing right here, I try to describe it. What I'm hearing here is that if I have this engaged, it frees up the low end a tiny bit so that I get just a tiny bit more punch is what I'm hearing. Like a little bit more precision, a little bit more stability in the low end. It's super subtle. If I flip this off, probably no consumer in the end will notice. It doesn't matter. That's my job as mastering engineer to hear these things, react accordingly, move on. So the next tool in my chain is typically a clipper. I use the K-clip. There are different clippers. All of them have pros and cons, but essentially they're doing the same thing. If you want me to do a video comparing clippers and limiters, leave a comment below. There is a difference, but they're also kind of similar in a certain way. What I use this for is I try to just get rid of some of the peaks that are standing out. So I go to the very busiest section around here. I see what the clipper is doing. And this is basically taking off some of the load that later on other dynamics processes will have to take on. For example, a compressor or a limiter. They don't have to work as hard if I get this in shape before. The mode that I use on this one is the crisp mode, because that is after a specific analog to digital converter that I just know still from the days when I was being mentored in a mastering studio and we had that converter available and the engineer showed me what's happening when the signals being pushed into this. I actually like it quite a lot on electronic music. I can push it a bit harder if I'm working on something like hard techno tracks or peak time. With something as relaxed as this here, I would just like literally tame it super transparently. So here's taken away 2 dB. I actually don't hear it. I literally can't hear it at all. So it's super transparent. So 2.4 dB is actually quite a lot. I will back this down a bit, but I still I don't really hear the clipping here, which is a good thing. So after the clipper, the question is, do we go into EQ first or do we go into compression first? There are a lot of truths out there that you will come across on the internet, especially on YouTube. So some people will tell you, you always have to EQ before compression. Others will tell you, you always have to compress before EQ. And there is no right or wrong in my opinion. People have different workflows and that's perfectly fine. And there's also different reasonings why you might use the one thing and then the other thing, or the other way around. I do it like this. I don't have like a fixed workflow. It's always like this. When I have material that needs a lot of EQing, that's like in really bad shape overall, and I need to correct the overall frequency response quite a bit, I tend to do this corrective EQing first, and then I go into compression so that the compressor does not have to work as hard and like react to something that's completely out of whack. If stuff like in this case, is pretty much in great shape and just have to do cosmetic EQ changes that just enhance a little bit here and there, I go for compression first and then EQing. And sometimes I do a combination where I do a little bit of EQing to correct, a little bit of compression, and then once again a little bit of EQing to once again shape it in a different way. So all of that is fine. If it sounds good, it is good. Find your workflow and learn to trust your own gut feeling. So let's go into the compressor. So I use the Kotelnikov quite a bit. I also use the Shadow Hills mastering compressor. The reason why I'm now going into the Kotelnikov is because this is a really transparent compressor. I don't think that this material that we're working with here needs a lot of warmth or a lot of the tone that might be introduced by the Shadow Hills. The Kotelnikov, there's a free version of this that does not have a couple of features. I have this like gentleman's edition, and the main reason why I prefer this version is this FTR, the frequency dependent ratio. Now this is quite nerdy. You don't really need it if you're not a mastering engineer. What this allows me is it allows me to edit the ratio, so how much does the compressor actually take away from the signal. It allows me to adjust this differently for the low end compared to the top end. So if I want to, for example, glue in some of the percussions in the top end, but I want the low end to be still super relaxed, I can draw in a shape like this, where the ratio at below 100 Hertz is almost 1:1, and then it gets to almost 2:1 when we're approaching like 10 kHz and above, which is also pretty cool for example, controlling sibilance. If you have to do a little bit of super transparent de-essing in a master, this can also work wonders with this tool. But even the free one has like low frequency relax, which allows you to leave the lower end intact. I actually made a video about this as well, so you figure out why you're probably overusing multiband compressors, and something like this might make more sense. Okay, attack times, I keep them relatively relaxed, so definitely longer than 30 milliseconds, typically around like 60, 80, sometimes 120. It depends on the material, but I want this to just be a glue compressor that leaves all the transients intact and then basically has a little bit of fast release time. So it's probably easier to just show than tell. This makes the groove a bit more stable while controlling these synths and also a little bit the percussions on the top end, but it's really, really gentle. It's just reducing 1 dB, maybe 1.5. It's obviously important to, especially if you compress a lot, you definitely have to make up for this with the gain. Here, the output gain is being trimmed. It's like an automatic trimmer that you can use, which basically adjusts accordingly to the last few seconds that have passed. Basically taking away in some instances a bit more than 1 dB, but overall the output gain is adjusted 0.5 dB. Don't get confused by these numbers. This still makes sense overall. Right, let's get into a little bit of EQing. The most important step in my opinion. And my EQ of choice is the Kirchhoff EQ. By the way, if you want to hear from me why I'm using certain plugins and what is kind of my go-to arsenal at the moment, I made a video about that as well, which you can check out here. 10 plugins that I'm currently using. It's still the case. There are some new additions, some that I'm using less, so I might do a follow-up video soon. Let's check this out. And the question is, what do we actually want to get out of this? So let's listen to the material once again. When I'm listening to this, what I'm hearing is that the sound is almost a little bit too lush, because I know what kinds of sets he wants to play this music in. I also know the reference tracks, and I think a tiny bit more of a dancey festival feeling would actually be nice for this to work a bit better. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to push the kick drum a tiny bit and see like if I can massage it in a way so that it sticks out a tiny bit more. And I will also bring probably the synths down just a little bit in low mids, and then push also the top end a tiny bit to bring out some of the airiness of the synths, but also some of the percussion sounds. So I'm going to do this as much in flow state as possible, so you just sit here and watch. Let's go into this. Okay, let's listen to the EQ before and after. Maybe bring it down a bit here as well. Now, as you can see, these are really subtle moves. So this is -1 dB, this is -1.4, plus 1.5, plus 1.7. So these are just very gentle moves to adjust it a little bit. In some instances, I actually also use something like Soothe or Dynamic EQ to just notch off the hell out of something that's super resonant and just happens in certain parts. There's a price for this to pay, of course, but if it's necessary, it's necessary. Here, everything's in pretty much good shape, so I just have to nudge it slightly into a certain direction. Now, how can we still optimize this even more? Let's listen to it. So I still would like to have the percussions just a tiny bit more edgy, a little bit more of that sizzle coming out. And sizzle is a good keyword here because there's actually a tool, one of my secret weapons in mastering. I'm going to show this to you now. So there is this very complex plugin called the Oven. I'm not going to walk you through the entire panel. Actually, I've read the manual, I don't know, 10 times, and I still don't fully get every single detail of the signal flow. It's really complex, but that does not mean that you cannot use it. The specific control that I like is this sizzle control here. For whatever reason, in many cases, I like the sizzle beat. Sounds a bit better on percussions, in my opinion. And what this does is it creates specific harmonics, especially on the very top end. But also, of course, you have to dial in the rest so that it works. I will do this now, then we'll see where we end up. Overdoing it now, but I wanted to hear the saturation that happens just on the top end. This is a really nice way to enhance the top end without making it harsh. So I will obviously not crank this to 10. Really nice. So we keep this lush sound, but we still introduce a tiny bit of that grit that's necessary for it to work in a club and festival context, especially if played with other more aggressive tracks maybe in the same set. Okay, let's now go back into our limiter and see how it performs currently. Exactly what happened is what I described before. So you can see that it's now basically reducing even less because everything else is in better shape before. It's very controlled. So we can theoretically even push it a bit harder and see how far we get. This is just by feel. I will see how dense it needs to feel and then also quickly compare it to some of the references. this is the perfect density for this song in my opinion. By the way, some of the crunchiness that you hear is something that's coming from the mix. It's not actually from the master. This is always important to understand when you create your own masters and you hear some distortion. It does not necessarily come from the limiter. Sometimes it's just something that's baked into your sound design. And if you want that, that's okay. If you don't want that, you have to get rid of it before. So let's quickly check out the references. Great, so I'm really happy with the results. So we are in the same ballpark. When you directly flip back and forth between them, it doesn't not necessarily sound quieter. It's also just produced in a more relaxed way, but you could definitely play these in the same set. And the cool thing is Spotify will bring the other ones down even more and will not bring it as much down. I'm really happy with the result here. I can already tell you Paul was super happy with the original master that I did in Wavelab as well. It will sound a little bit different probably, the final version that you saw, because I mastered this in a different session in Wavelab, but this is definitely very close to that. So what you now have to do is you have to obviously adjust the start and end points. So here you want to trim a little bit at the beginning, you want to trim a little bit at the end. So just to make sure that you don't have too much silence there, but I also would never let the file start with the first hit, because on CDJs, for example, the software very often will just not detect the first hit and actually do the whole beat grid wrong simply due to that. So I would just get rid of the very beginning and then maybe create a little bit of a fade here. Just listen to that. Then at the very end, I actually like this S-curve type fade. I just have to see how long it takes. Bit too aggressive. Nice. After that, all you have to do is you basically export your file. And one important thing is if you export this for distributors, a lot of them will accept 44.1 16-bit files. Some will even accept 44.1 24-bit files. I would never give them a different sample rate because you never know what kind of resampling algorithm they will use. Now, overall, Ableton, in my experience, is not the best resampling algorithm. You maybe want to use a different tool for that if you can. But we are here at 48. Obviously, if we just export this in 44.1, we go to export here. And then what you want to do is you select 44.1 as sample rate. And you also, if you export it in 24-bit, you want to use a dither. And in 16-bit, you also want to use a dither. Now, to be honest with you, different dithers here really doesn't make sense for you to go into these details. They might sound slightly different, but overall dithering is important because when you go from a higher bit depth to a lower one and some bits get truncated, this actually makes up for it. So it's like a little bit of a micro noise floor in very quiet parts. This gets added so that the bits get filled and therefore you don't have like any truncation distortion. So you go to 16-bit or to 24-bit, whatever files you need for your distributor, and you export it. And then the really important thing is to also do a listening pass of the whole track and making sure that your settings work in all parts. And maybe you have to do a little bit of automation, maybe you have to change something. All of that is possible in mastering. I will not do this for the YouTube video now, but typically this would be the final step of quality control, listening to this with all the plugins, then exporting the file and also listening to the exported file, of course, making sure that everything's in order. Then you're good to go. If you got any value out of this, consider subscribing to the channel, consider liking this video. I hope to see you in the next one.